region. Let's welcome our once-a-month guest, Mike Muller, head of Vitol Asia. Mike, I welcome your thoughts. We can review particularly those two developments that I referenced and anything else that's on your thoughts at the moment.
There's so much on our minds at the moment. So, I mean, one of your articles referred to 100 days of conflict in Ukraine. And of course, Shanghai came out of 61, I think, days worth of lockdown. So that created some interesting scenes and some temporary euphoria about the opening up there. And of course, the OPEC Plus Accord you mentioned, another quick meeting, but this time a surprise. And just keeping people on their toes, I guess. What it amounts to in terms of numbers is an extra 7 million barrels a day in the month of July, and same again in August.
An extra 7 million?
Final, well, yes, 216,000 barrels per day.
Oh, okay. Okay, right? I get you.
Up from the 432 to 648. So that's 216,000 barrels a day multiplied by 31 days is roughly 70 barrels of oil.
Okay.
Which put in those terms is roughly the same amount of oil that we've seen moving, interestingly, from the Arabian Gulf to the Western Hemisphere in some rather interesting moves. But of course, all eyes remain on what's happening with Russian output and indeed the latest round of EU sanctions, which contained a number of carve-outs. So whilst the resolve was very strong to stop completely all imports of Russian oil into the EU, there were carve-outs for Czechia, for Hungary, and for the littoral states in the Black Sea that successfully made their case that they're still dependent and still need of doing this. So in some cases, they have a wind down generously. So 10 months in the case of Czechia, for example. And therefore, in the eyes of some, the lobbying that obviously centered on Hungary initially to try and somehow compensate them from the European coffer so that they can fall in line didn't take place. And then, of course, you have a group of people who have always been of the opinion that closing down so much Russian oil is detrimental to the economy, is detrimental in terms of spiraling high oil prices, and that even the US administration doesn't particularly want to see prices get out of control because they've pulled a number of levers already. They've pulled the SPR lever. Of course, there's a little more SPR to go. Europe in particular could release a lot of the one product that's really quite hot right now, diesel. But they're also holding back for that rainy day. And the big debate in Europe is, well, is that rainy day now? Or could things get a lot worse? What actually happens with OPEC Plus output, of course, is a different matter. There is a commonly held view that really only the UAE and Saudi have spare capacity, and the debate now focuses on what exactly is that number. What can those two countries produce sustainably? Because nobody really knows. It's subsurface and it's not been tested, other than a couple of surge production high water marks that were set by the Saudis. Too much fanfare, of course, just before COVID struck, and those were in the high 12s. But the smart money is of the view that the Saudi current sustainable production limit is somewhere 11 point something, and that's a pretty wide range. And yes, the quota gets them to 10.8 and then above. And we must remind ourselves most other OPEC Plus members are already at their limit, and therefore this provides an open goal for Saudi and the UAE to make up the shortfall. Notably also, some may recall that there was a month, which I think was March, or maybe, yeah, I believe it's just a few months back, when you may recall the Saudi OSPs went very high because of the formula, and a lot of people felt that that was too much at once, and there was an undernomination. So I think there's a little up their sleeves as well, and it's going to be very interesting to see how OPEC Plus continue with the treatment of those who have catch up to do, both in terms of having overproduced and having underproduced, and that runs through to the end of this year. In one of your comments, there was also reference to the fact that this advances by 1 month the next steps, what comes after. And it was very notable to see Alexander Novak of Russia and the OPEC Plus core members reaffirm publicly the desire to keep Russia in the club as they go forward and transition to the what next. And I'll close with Russia itself, of course. In one of your articles that you have in your pre-read, there's a reference to 600,000 barrels a day of Russian products going missing. Of course, there's an expectation in the market that that's going to increase. But we look at information available today, which of course is markets that traded 1.5 months ago. Crude output from Russia is still level pegging with what it was, and it's products that have been hit. And the considered view, I guess, is that products will continue to be hit, but harder. And that production shortfall can be made up by the OPEC Plus accelerated increase. Plus, of course, we mustn't forget that the SPR release is ongoing. So lots and lots of ingredients there. But let me just close my opening statement here. Sorry, it's so lengthy, short, by some comments on Asia. I mean, China, outside of China, there is a view that the demand rebound is quite something, quite extraordinary. And of course, coming back from a lower base, but a lot of the Southeast Asian countries where I'm based are very much exceeding expectations in terms of road transportation demand. And I think I said this last month already, but try buying an air ticket in Singapore summer holidays. It is awfully tough. And the airlines are going for it, as are the hotels. And that's an indication, if anything, that this pent-up demand to travel and to spend is still there. And of course, all attention now on whether that can be replicated in the lower middle classes and the working class populations, because they're spending a lot more than they would have done.
Mike, I wanted to get your thoughts on these two particular topics around the issue of credibility. The EU oil embargo on Russia and the OPEC Plus agreement or adjustment last week. And from a market participant point of view, how much credibility you put in both of those decisions, and how much you bank on them, so to speak. Obviously, the market went up after the OPEC decision. My thesis would be that the OPEC Plus credibility, our ability to influence or jawbone prices downward is negligible. Their credibility of overproducing or rather underproducing for months. They haven't met their own agreement. So how could the market really take them as credible? You could add any number on the top of the list they already had because the credibility issue. So I'm wondering your thoughts on credibility as a market influencing act, the EU credibility to impose this embargo and OPEC Plus to meet this new target.
Goodness me, Sean, you used the word credibility many times there. It's very dangerous because we're talking about some highly respected individuals, politicians and protagonists in the OPEC Plus club. And I mean, yes, you could say that.
Well, it's like the point, just to interrupt you, Mike, just to interrupt you generally on the Fed side, you know, there's a general narrative the Fed has lost credibility. They're behind the curve. They're trying to catch up. They did a 25 basis point. Now they're having a conveyor belt of 50 basis points. You could say the same with OPEC Plus. They've had the chance to meet their own agreement for months. They haven't done so. And now we've had a tepid little increase.
Well, I think it's just a realization that oil prices remain a little more resilient than some would have forecast, and that they are giving a little signal in response to strong requests from the Americans to keep prices under control and not add fuel to a fire where there is a concern about escalating costs to consumer and therefore the recession impact thereof. As I mentioned, I don't think the extra 216,000 barrels a day is going to make all that much difference. If you translate it, it's 3.5 VLCCs of extra production. And yes, it remains to be seen whether they actually put it out, because I think the only way they're going to be able to put out 648,000 barrels per day extra month on month is if the slack is taken up by those countries that have spare capacity. And I'll just be repeating myself, that's in the hands of Saudis and the Emiratis and really not too many others. So I think better we focus on the European side of things. They tried awfully hard, but Christoph has already answered the question. Building consensus amongst 27 nations, which needs unanimity when there are divergent priorities and economic incentives, as Hungary so nicely explained, it is awfully, awfully hard. And whilst Ursula and Charles made their best effort there, if you look at it from the perspective of the large listed majors, it doesn't change much about what they're doing. They were already self-sanctioning and not taking any Russian crude into their refining system, and this really only tightens matters around a smaller number of people that have so far been continuing to avail themselves of Russian oil. What changes, of course, is quite important, is up until now you could buy Russian crude without any questions asked, on the assumption that you needed it in order to supply your environments around your refinery. What changes is that now you need a piece of paper that acknowledges that there was indeed a demonstrable need for it, and that's it might sound a little bit bureaucratic, but I think that does signal that the intent is indeed to make it a little more difficult, a lot more difficult for European refiners. But you also touched on other things. I think Christoph referred to the shipping side of things. It's pretty important. I mean, this week happens to be the conference that takes place every 2 years in Athens, where the shipping community get together in their thousands to talk about what's happening. And I'm sure this theme will dominate matters, which is to what extent are EU registered ship owners restricted from carrying sanctioned oil. And the non-mainstream trade is going to be quite large, and the very real prospect of ships passing in the Suez Canal, one going north, one going south, both carrying more or less the same product, because you have an Asian market that is still taking Russian oil without any restrictions in certain countries, India and China, and on the other hand, that brings about surpluses or natural trade flows, whereby Europe is calling for material, and this goes for just about anything, any blended products, certain crudes. And of course, Europe is still sucking a lot of LNG across this way. So yeah, I don't like the word credibility, but I guess the effectiveness of these measures that are being taken is the question. And I'll come back to what I hinted at before. There is room for those OPEC members, core OPEC, that have spare capacity to make up the slack if they wish. And I think all eyes will be on whether the Saudis in particular do that. They choose to do that. Because according to some, there was a little bit of undertake from the markets or under allocation in one of the recently elapsed months, and that's by rights production they could add to the market if they feel that's the right thing to do. And I think they will respond to signals. If the price continues to hold above 120 and push towards 130, they'll be more inclined to do so. As for the point you made on the problem being in products and not so much in crude, if you roll the clock 2 months forward to the periods we're trading, and in the East it's very much August now, there is a very real prospect with these margins that refineries are going flat out, cancelling turnarounds and trying to make as much product as they can. That combined with the demand loss at these higher prices, which is very real. If you switch on your TV and look at countries like Sri Lanka, there is clearly demand destruction going on, and not just there, in Africa and other places. The problem is likely to be translated from products tightness to crude tightness. And then the issue kicks in, how much demand losses are going to be due to high prices. And again, the range of estimates there varies wildly, but if you pick 1 million barrels a day, that more or less totally offsets the incremental supply loss from Russia.
Mike, I wanted to come back on your point there, and I think it's that nexus between economic pent-up demand versus complete meltdown, right? Sri Lanka versus Singapore. The outlook in Asia, we've got Nepal on the borderline of bankruptcy. We've got Pakistan below 10 billion of foreign reserves and heading towards what many analysts are forecasting not too far behind Sri Lanka. And yet you have this outlook, as you articulate, of pent-up mobility in Asia. I'm just wondering where you see those two universes, the consequence of these literally sovereign bankruptcies in Sri Lanka's case and others to follow.
Sure, the audio is a bit off, but yes, I think you've already articulated it quite well. I mean, the divide between the prosperous and the countries that have lower ability to pay for commodities across the spectrum is becoming extremely stark, and people in the let's call it first world perhaps unwittingly passing the problems on to those that do not have the have-nots. And yes, the credit challenges around supplying certain countries that you mentioned there are extreme, and they fall very much under the remit of what I do here. We have tenders that we're facing into these countries where the government is getting actively involved in pleading with creditors to help them keep the country supplied, because we see the consequences of what happened. There was I think a tear gas canister that went into the belly of a Sri Lankan chap that was trying to obtain fuel, and the poor chap died. I mean, this is not pleasant reading, and there tends to be a correlation between social unrest and shortages of fuel, when of course countries like Sri Lanka have to secure food and pharmaceuticals ahead of all that. So yes, the world has to take note of the fact that this is becoming a problem. And of course, for us people monitoring supply and demand, it's something that hits demand very, very graphically. You mentioned Pakistan, of course, a huge economy with political challenges, transition government in place, and as you say, with reserves running low also. So it hits demand. And unfortunately, from the perspective of those in our market that sit in places like Singapore, a lot of distraction coming from China, and indeed the the purchasing power in other parts of Asia, causing them to worry about their holidays and spending 3 times more on their air tickets, and what that means in terms of demand. We're seeing record numbers going through at the pumps in Malaysia, for example, post Ramadan, and it looks like some of these economies are very much still in catch-up mode. So yes, a tale of two worlds, and very sadly, the problems that emanate from the Russia-Ukraine crisis are being passed on by countries, even Japan, that put in place a fuel subsidy, believe it or not, a couple of months back, unwittingly, I guess, to the less payment-worthy countries. Sean, I don't think we'd be complete if we didn't talk about Iran a little bit, if I may. I mean,
sure.
You have to take a view that the status quo is this, right? The US is allowing a certain amount of flows under carve-out, which they've given the sort of silent okay to, namely flows to China. And at the same time, there's also a certain amount of Venezuelan flow that is condoned. But it would appear like if we assume the JCPOA is more or less hacked out, that it's a political decision centering around the refusal of the Americans to accede to the request to drop the designation of the Republican Guard as a terror organization. This is a sticking point that's likely to persist. And I think most analysts now don't have any Iranian oil coming back this year, but it is another form of release in terms of oil ready to go now because of so much being in storage and floating. 100 and something million barrels, take your pick, regarding where the condensate is. Now, I think the window of political opportunity for the Biden administration to reach a deal with Iran is already evaporating, if not gone, because they're getting into midterms soon. But if the midterms are dominated by needing to keep gas prices low in America, turning a somewhat greater blind eye to these sanctioned barrels flowing out and competing with Russian for that matter, is probably something that you might expect to see. And the US intervention in these flows has always been pretty sparse anyway. So whilst I don't think there's going to be a deal, I think the clamping down and arresting of ships, even though there was some going on in the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean just recently, and then a reciprocal arrest of ships in the Hormuz area, I think there's a chance that Uncle Sam might just allow a little bit more of that oil to flow, which is not good for markets because it creates a three-tier market, if you like, right?
Well, Mike, just on that point, if you've got those two pieces, right, you've got the Iranian leak, and now you've got these heavily discounted Russian barrels coming into Asia, coming into China, and looking to increase. How should the Saudis and the Gulf Arabs look at that? Is that a threat to their market? Is it no big deal over the midterm?
This is where this huge range of views comes in. I mean, if you believe that things are going to remain pretty tight and there's not enough oil to go around because of spare capacity concerns and the whole underinvestment theme, then those consultants and those experts believe that we need those Iranian surpluses to come to the market because there's nowhere else to bring it from. If you believe that the Saudis have an extra million barrels of spare capacity and that there's going to be substantial demand destruction because of recessionary concerns and high commodity prices, then you don't. So no, I think we need to remain cautious, and let's not underestimate the volume of barrels coming out of SPRs still hitting markets now. And you can see it manifesting itself in shipping rates for dirty freight. Those markets have not really gone anywhere, despite the fact that you have the sanctions causing oil to move from west to east and all that. So I think I don't think the markets are overheating, but I do think the range of expert opinions out there has never been wider. There are people who think the market's going to 135, 140. And there are also people who think we're going below 100 again. And how that plays out is very much a function of demand and the impact of these higher prices on demand. And whilst I think that the affluent world is going to have their holidays and burn jet fuel and cause airlines to schedule flights, Singapore Airlines apparently recruited 2,500 flight attendants last week, which they need to do, I can tell you, because I can't get tickets. But the impact elsewhere is a lot more profound. And for the more challenged middle classes that have higher energy, higher food bills, this year's holiday is fine, but I think the Christmas ski holiday and next year's vacation next summer might be an economic pinch. So I think that's just my way of illustrating that we have a couple of hard breaks on this thing, which it's hard to say what it means for oil price, but I don't think we're off to the races as you suggest, Sean.